Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. Tonight, we're blending the soothing sound of the rain with unsettling and chilling stories, so you can truly let go and relax. If this mix of calm and unease feels like your kind of escape, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss more long, rainy nights of narrative dread. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. Now, let the rain surround you, and allow the stories to pull you into the night. Story 1. It wasn't merely the feeling of running out of space. It was the crushing, systemic realization that was actively running out of geometrical permission, that the lack of space was not an accident of poor building design, but an aggressively deliberate, architecturally planned temporal and spatial negation. I am Daniel Cole. My civilian transition after service as a structural logistics auditor for the Air Force led me to a uniquely peculiar, isolated life, acting as the solitary temporary facility custodian for the sprawling, entirely abandoned, mid-range housing development. Palm Crest Vistas, a huge, 500-unit ghost community built 2 years ahead of the 2008 fiscal crash in the stagnant outer subdivisions of Central Florida. My personal residence, my single source of stability and income, was the model home for the entire development, a pristine, fully furnished, 3-bedroom single-story ranch model surrounded by completely sealed, uninhabited, silent cul-de-sacs of identically silent houses. The model home, my current sanctuary, was built for a highly aggressive, single, absolute objective, absolute aesthetic perfection for fast architectural sales. It was a sterile, brightly lit museum of ideal, unlived in domesticity, filled with meticulously organized, utterly static decorative artifacts that should never, ever be functionally used. My duty was merely to maintain the absolute aesthetic integrity, logging the temperature and the lighting schedule until the market recovered. The entire psychological siege of the model home claustrophobia began not with movement, but with the profound, aggressive silent shrinking of the single largest, single most unused structural space, the long, unnervingly white ground floor main hallway. I began to realize that the structural constants I had logged and depended upon simply were no longer true. At the beginning of my 6-month contract, I logged the pure structural dimension of the hallway for utility audit measurements, 45 feet, 6 inches in true, objective length. After 3 completely solitary months, a vague, psychological dissonance made me re-verify the measurement. Armed with a laser-driven, self-calibrating distance meter, I measured the absolute structural separation again. The hallway now measured 45 feet, 4.2 inches. A precise, non-negotiable shrinkage of 1.8 inches in linear space had occurred, systematically and quietly, against the established foundational truth. The entire house was imperceptibly, aggressively collapsing in on itself. I spent 7 frantic days running acoustic sensors, thermal signatures, geological integrity measures, all entirely dedicated to locating the single structural aberration that would explain a geometric collapse that logically could not happen in a structure built on a modern concrete slab. All physical proof of stress or decay simply vanished upon measurement. The internal steel was not stressed. The concrete was not fractured. The building was merely conceding its internal space in cold, precise, total silence. The architectural contraction was the single, unyielding structural will of the entity, which I called the geometrical sheriff. This entity immediately and violently targeted the aesthetics of any simple object that displayed unintentional disorder, demanding absolute digital perfection in the single copy, unbreached domestic space. My psychological armor began to entirely fail during a routine audit of the vast, sealed storage pantry door. The relentless aggression of the shrinking house was met with my complete structural denial. I placed a single object on the highly polished surface for a full 24 hours to defy the structural conformity. A single, black, worn, industrial-grade steel tape measure, its silver end hook lying precariously outside the geometric boundary of the structural frame. The next morning, the structural size of the entire hallway had been reabsorbed by a precise 0.2 further inches. And the single object on the shelf was entirely transformed into an aesthetically perfect, physical mockery of its original structure. The industrial steel tape measure was now entirely gone from the precise position where I had so aggressively left it, removed without sound nor visual event. But what remained was the structural negation, 2 feet from where the industrial tape measure should have been, embedded surgically into the solid, heavy quarter-inch veneered kitchen countertop, was an absolutely perfect, highly complex, geometric etching, a single, thin, aggressive line etched 1 millimeter deep into the synthetic material, representing its entire 300-inch length. The entire functional space of the industrial artifact had been violently, instantly collapsed into its flat, 2-dimensional geometric code, all fixed perfectly onto the pristine white surface. The attack wasn't merely spatial, it was dimensional. The structural collapse was aiming to eliminate the utility of the single 3-dimensional space I still relied upon. The siege escalated with a terrifying, total inversion of the most intimate, structural defense I had left, my own internal acoustic existence, all driven by the physical anomaly embedded beneath the pristine structure. My absolute terror now relied entirely on the persistent, structural acoustic whisper emanating from the single, massive, clean white structural column in the ground floor living room, a pillar designed merely for aesthetic purpose. The thick, inert structural column began to produce a constant, chilling acoustic sound that was never there before. It was a faint, yet pervasive, multispectral digital weeping. The sound was entirely focused on the relentless, rapid-fire clicking of what sounded precisely like a highly advanced, ancient photographic lens violently, angrily clicking its focus mechanism at high speed, timed perfectly to a single, faint, high-frequency, electronic groaning that sounded entirely synthesized and metallic. The column was actively photographing and archiving the chaos within the space. The ultimate confrontation was engaged when the shrinking geometry finally attacked the single most vital, active structural component of the living unit, the refrigeration cooling unit, a massive food storage complex whose structural presence and heat output defined the entire equilibrium of my minimal existence. The internal temperature of the massive refrigerator began to drop violently to 0 degrees, a complete, aggressive thermal surrender, defying all attempts at internal maintenance. And from the structural back panel of the large, metal refrigerator, a single, clear, absolute voice erupted, synthesized, cold, and entirely digitized, speaking in a measured, cold administrative baritone, the first direct verbal declaration of its entire systematic will. Compliance. Unit cold. Aesthetics over rent. YOUMUSTOBYTHELINE. HEATISTHIRTYDAYNOTIC. Final digital chord cold and perfect. The entity's protocol had been issued: maintain the perfect, cold aesthetic for the sale, or face immediate structural expulsion. My human presence, with its inherent metabolic warmth and structural disorder, was the single element aggressively fighting the structural conformity it craved. The entity demanded structural purity. I abandoned the shrinking house only after initiating a definitive act of complete, self-destructive structural chaos. I poured every available chemical cleaning agent, corrosive solvent, and industrial-grade paint I could find into the core of the single immaculate, self-cleaning HVAC unit. The ensuing explosion of toxic, uncontrolled chemical fumes was the single greatest psychological release I could create against an entity that demanded structural pristineness. I now live in a constant, dense chemical funk in a structurally chaotic, half-built plywood industrial site, constantly moving my physical body on unpredictable paths. I avoid perfectly painted surfaces and straight lines at all costs. The terrifying truth is that the model home is still there, its walls contracting aggressively, demanding absolute structural compliance for its final, cold aesthetic judgment, eternally waiting for a final, stationary buyer who can entirely embrace the single, final, structural flaw of its existence, the complete, precise, final zero-point structural dimension achieved at the point of utter self-annihilation. Story 2. The electromagnetic trace. Nothing that relies on current ever truly dies forever. It simply retreats beyond the visible and acoustic wavelength. For 2 decades, that was the cold, immutable professional truth that earned me enormous consulting fees and an eternal, deep-set paranoia about unplugged appliances. I introduced myself as Daniel Thorne. I specialized in what the utility companies wryly call forensic signal reclamation, the expensive, dangerous, and isolated task of analyzing and eliminating the residual electrical and acoustic noise left behind in aging, decommissioned underground structural conduits. My current contract, shrouded in legal non-disclosure thickets, involved the systematic acoustic and electromagnetic deep clean of the immense, cold, unused sublevel utility tunnels lying directly beneath the entire ruined, chemically contained footprint of the 1990s West Coast Industrial Reactor Facility disaster. A massive industrial catastrophe that was immediately followed by a catastrophic communications failure that led to an irreversible internal implosion. I was deep under Santa Monica, cleaning the structural skeleton of a forgotten technological nightmare. The sheer structural mass of the complex defined my isolation: endless, concrete-lined tunnels, smelling perpetually of ozone, stagnant water, and deeply burnt synthetic rubber, all perfused by the dense, chemical hum of millions of copper and fiber lines carrying the silent, cold electricity of an utterly defunct operational command system. My mission was clinical: erase the environmental noise that persisted in the final, structural minutes before the disaster. The immediate terror I faced was not a physical ghost, but a pure, aggressive, technological reproduction of the disaster's final acoustic moments, carried entirely on the latent electrical charge within the abandoned copper wire itself. The entity was the electromagnetic ghost. It started as a simple noise, a faint, rhythmic click-snap of an old model computer keyboard, coming from deep within the structural labyrinth of the unlit cable tunnels, always precisely 80 feet from my flashlight beam. I set up specialized, calibrated, parabolic absorption equipment designed to filter out ambient structural noise and isolate the core residual signal. The moment the equipment captured the sound fully, my internal defenses suffered a deep, final technical break. The single input source was the relentless noise of the keyboard click-snap, but it was immediately accompanied by a clear, high-fidelity synchronized human male voice, digitally synthesized, calm, and utterly terrifying in its cold precision, delivering a steady, rhythmic, professional data input. Status: TELEMETRYCOREISREDACTED. Initiate CRYPTOSHIFTNOW. COOPRISOUTOFHAZARDTRMINAL. The psychological annihilation was complete. The ghost operator was no mere thermal trace. It was a pure, organized memory trace, a digital audio recording of the exact, human action final moment of organized command execution, the precise acoustic signal that led an unknown coworker to escape. The entity was actively replaying its exact protocol command sequence in endless, cold, acoustic loops, using the massive abandoned conductive mass of the deep copper tunnels as its transmission medium, demanding its own digital action sequence be permanently, technically, and physically completed. My entire professional existence was now consumed by the desperate need to eliminate the structural core of the technological terror. I determined, after an intense acoustic survey, that the relentless replay was physically localized to a single, deep, circular, heavy-gauge copper and fiber tracheal bundle, a cable hub 5 feet thick, running perpendicular to the main tunnel, the last piece of active digital flow before the final, catastrophic structural surge. I worked 6 hours straight, my hands trembling with cold panic, installing a high-resistance, industrial-grade Faraday induction field system around the massive bundle, designed to completely chemically sever the copper's ability to conduct static electromagnetism and, subsequently, eliminate the phantom acoustic memory trace entirely. The moment the final pin of the immense Faraday shield was physically sunk and anchored to the structural wall, the entity responded to my structural aggression with a terrifying, total sonic rebellion. The air immediately surrounding the cable bundle exploded with profound, chaotic acoustic pain, followed by a horrific, single sound pulse that rattled the entire concrete structure of the sublevel tunnel for half a full minute. It was the synchronized, aggressive, sustained scream of 10 agonizing, simultaneous, dying human voices, amplified by the precise, organized acoustic density of the abandoned, cold tunnels to an unimaginable, piercing ferocity. The raw sound of organized human pain was its only acoustic reply. The physical result of the sound explosion was immediate, organized, and terrifying. My entire security-grade industrial high-wattage field lamp, my only white light defense, imploded violently on its heavy aluminum tripod, fragmenting into 1,000 pieces of chemicalized hot glass that rained down on the steel grate of the tunnel floor, leaving me trapped in absolute, profound, digital darkness and surgical temperature cold. I retreated, terrified and blind, back to my main console, seeking an immediate full structural evacuation. But the terror surpassed all the possibilities of simple flight. The screen of my command console, now illuminated by a single, erratic emergency red lantern in the immense shadow, was completely blank, save for one terrifying, final sentence, appearing slowly in large, cold, electronic white letters, entirely unfilterable, unquenchable, and utterly permanent. FINALZROHOUR DONTSEALTHEDATA THEPLYWOODBOXES MUSTBEMOVD TODAY. Final digital signature, the calm, cold sound of my child's heartbeat, perfectly recorded, played on perpetual loop. The terrifying command was now personal, focused not on the copper itself but on the unknown plywood archive boxes on the unsealed top level, that held the fragile, structural key to the entire communication. The protocol had been physically imposed. The only way to complete the purge was the catastrophic transfer of the physical, flammable, vulnerable boxes. Desperate, I grabbed my last crowbar, abandoning my technical expertise entirely, and sprinted blindly toward the single airlock that separated the clean sublevel with the massive, combustible, paper and plywood-filled top level of the ruin. I was forced to climb the 5 flights into the dry, flammable, uncontained structural disaster. I located the unsealed plywood boxes, hundreds of them, and began shoving them with violent force through the steel airlock to the deepest, cold, unlit lower tunnels, intending to chemically contaminate them all with static ozone dust. Only after violently pushing the last of the wooden terror into the silent, cold void did I stop, utterly exhausted, realizing a terrifying, final logical flaw: a physical power system cannot electrically possess a simple wooden box. My entire physical effort had been spent obeying the acoustic command of a malignant, non-corporeal system that could structurally recreate acoustic history and was entirely focused on the organized, flammable transfer of its own paper archive to be structurally preserved in the single best conductive material money could buy. I initiated a systematic destruction of the 2 structural bridges to the safe surface, leaving the terrified entity now entirely sealed and trapped in the immense, conductive power of its million copper threads without access to the final, protective layer of flammable structure. My escape was my ultimate self-destruction and total material forfeiture. I now live in a deliberate anti-technological, raw dirt farm in rural Idaho, entirely devoted to analog systems, wearing rubberized boots at all times to avoid any contact with static electricity and any non-human conducting surfaces. The terrifying truth is that some technological failures do not vanish. They structurally repossess the very medium of their own destruction, eternally broadcasting a physical, aggressive acoustic truth that demands one specific, precise physical action from the breathing world. I still wake up at night to the terrifying sound of children weeping beneath my floor, convinced the relentless, cold structural chaos of the abandoned copper is still trying to locate the final, isolated asset to complete its self-written, permanent digital protocol catastrophe. Story 3. The soil should not warm beneath your feet. It is an immutable, cold geological fact. When I finally learned this terrifying truth, I was already standing ankle-deep and irreversibly trapped in its ancient, dark secret. My name is Silas Finch. I spent 40 years of my life as a professional land surveyor and structural evaluator, my entire psychological construct anchored to the dry, measurable certainty of immutable bedrock and predictable water flow. My last private venture, my retirement project, was the purchase of a deceptively beautiful, heavily wooded, aggressively unworked acreage along the Maine Vermont border, a pristine spot of heavy, ancient forest leading down into a wide, swamp-filled, highly unusual sphagnum peat bog, a massive, self-contained vascular body of aggressive, dark, decaying organic material. I planned to build. I instead built a shallow, temporary wooden refuge over a profound, cold terror. The environment immediately fought my presence. The humidity here was oppressive not in heat, but in its dense, chemically rich moisture, the sharp, acidic smell of thousand-year-old, compressed sphagnum peat moss, dry organic decay, and something intensely, terrifyingly metallic. This unique, pervasive organic odor was the breath of the entity, which I rapidly identified as the bog collector, whose singular purpose was the structural defense of its incredibly ancient, biologically pure domain against the invasive human warmth. The geological surface of the vast marsh was the first structure to demonstrate utter sentience. The thick, surface-level peat, a dense mat of living and dead roots, was perpetually, unnaturally warm to the touch. Not the passive warmth of solar collection, but a specific, aggressive, mid-level fever-damp organic heat that seemed to pulse rhythmically from the absolute black core of the liquid bog. The fever permeated the entirety of the low-level water table, actively defying the severe structural cold of the early winter air. The structural heat was its source of organized power. My psychological descent began with the inexplicable, progressive, highly accelerated physical extraction of my internal energy, my organic heat and basic physical life force. Every morning, I awoke profoundly cold, despite a massive, aggressive heating apparatus in the small cabin room, and felt a pervasive, frightening stiffness and coldness localized entirely in my hands and feet, a cold that resisted all physical heating applications, blankets, fire. The cold was not external. It was the intense, physical, structural withdrawal of my own core biological heat, systematically being sucked out of my extremities by a malignant force operating beneath the structural supports of my cabin. I ran complex biometrics on myself. My core body temperature was physically stable, but the local air saturation showed a profound and immense negative thermal field immediately surrounding my physical extremities, absorbing every single available calorie of life force and transmuting it into raw, aggressive, organic heat within the black soil. The entity was feeding on my warmth, slowly, structurally, with clinical patience. The structural violence escalated from silent organic consumption to an aggressive, focused manipulation against the physical environment required for my survival. The entity was actively targeting the organic stability of my life support system. I kept my winter logging supply, my single most critical wood-based material source, stacked high and dry on a 3-foot-tall temporary pallet system outside in the clearing. I stepped outside one twilight and found the entire massive structural pallet of dry, hard maple logs and planks gone, not stolen, completely and structurally submerged with utter, immediate, powerful silence into the soft, unresistant surface of the black sphagnum and peat marsh less than 3 feet from its secure resting spot. The entire stack of bone-dry, dense organic material had been swallowed completely by the aggressively warm, porous matrix of the bog soil itself, leaving behind only the single highest, softest piece of outer cloth covering, now flatly, wetly resting on the impenetrable black surface. The entity was actively harvesting all organic material in an aggressive perimeter expansion. The terrifying climax of the systemic consumption was reached when the entity violated my final, absolute sanctuary, the single 4-foot-thick, isolated stone foundation upon which I had built my single working structure, my small research cabin. The massive, immovable stone had been my single, unyielding defense against the swamp's organic chaos. I was huddled inside the cabin late one midnight, my heat pump screaming in futile defiance against the structural cold, when the intense structural pressure focused entirely on a single point, the absolute center of the large, smooth, granite slab that served as my floor. It had always been cold and inert. Now, it was exhibiting a specific structural deformation, and from that one specific spot, the entity began to project a structural, rhythmic sound I could now recognize as raw, physical effort of immense, consuming power, a deep, profound, continuous slurp-gather-suck slurp, the sound of an organic, intelligent, high-volume biological source aggressively drinking immense quantities of a thick, visceral substance. The sound was so intense, so localized on the structural seal, it sounded as if the earth itself had sealed its own structural mouth directly against the underside of the clean, smooth granite. Then, the final, single, perfect sound erupted from precisely the center of the granite slab, rising to acute acoustical clarity that spoke directly to my human psychological distress. It was the synthesized, digitally perfect voice of a young woman, sounding profoundly cold, empty, and devoid of fear, delivering a single, highly technical, psychological message of absolute finality. It requires the simple protein for the transfer. You contain the best thermal energy. You must cease the resistance. Your clock is fully integrated into the peat. NORTHLIGHTS. COLDISCOLD. Final burst of chaotic, beautiful, amplified high-frequency violin music. The acoustic terror was complete. The entity had found me through another person, knew my single structural fear, the loss of organic heat, and had structurally integrated my own mechanical defense mechanisms, my perpetual wind-up watch, into its domain. The granite was the final structural barrier, and it was failing. I initiated my final, complete, catastrophic failure, the systematic, structural annihilation of my own, single-man refuge structure. I smashed my entire stove into 1,000 pieces, ignited all my dry records and documents in a chaotic fire, and ran full speed from the profound, suicidal aesthetic of the perfect, clean swamp, abandoning the structural protection I thought would save me. I now live a purposefully nomadic life of total human dependency, moving perpetually across the chaotic, unpredictable population centers of the American South. I do not own physical structures. I no longer eat vegetables, consume liquids, or touch any form of cold, organic soil. My diet is synthetic powders and pure mineral salts. The horrific structural truth is that the bob collector remains there in the cold New England soil, its core life force maintained by the stolen systemic heat of all the organic life that dared intrude upon the singular, pure, unresistant flow of its ancient, chemical sleep, patiently waiting for the single, lonely, predictable human soul whose warmth is the only final, aggressive, structural proof of life the immense, organic predator requires for its final moment of cold consumption. Story 4. My life was defined by the dry truth of the blueprint. An absolute, dry, non-negotiable solid line etched onto paper. That was the primary, central conviction of my professional existence, a truth held to the final, structural millimeter. That was my anchor to sanity, until that single, permanent line decided to physically, structurally, aggressively move on its own accord. I am Dr. Alistair Kress. I was once among the elite in structural pre-design, an aggressively paranoid man whose architectural genius lay in creating perfectly balanced, psychologically secure, entirely closed-loop living spaces. After my acute exposure to the corrosive nature of the building industry, I retreated into a self-imposed, absolute confinement, a vast, unwindowed, single-story concrete bunker structure I had personally designed and built exactly 20 years ago in an utterly anonymous desert sprawl in Oklahoma. It was a space designed with only one variable, my complete control. The very heart and soul of my control structure was the archive vault, a double-locked, humidity-sealed vault room deep at the geometric center of the bunker. Inside lay my entire professional legacy, thousands of my original, hand-drafted, aggressive blueprints and CAD schematics, the dry, precise intellectual core of all my designs. These prints, protected by 2 inches of copper shielding and a massive steel door, were the physical embodiment of my absolute, frozen architectural will. The psychological war began with a subtle, terrifying, organized shift in the physical orientation of my internal space, completely defying the fixed reality of the concrete and steel. I woke one cold morning in my hermetically sealed bedroom space and was structurally disoriented. The fixed, load-bearing concrete structural column I had meticulously designed to sit 25 feet from the foot of my bed, according to the archived master blueprint, now measured out exactly 24 feet, 4 inches. The architectural space itself had shrunk by 8 inches in a perfectly clean, surgical shift of the core structure. My reality had been subtly redimensioned during my sleep by an implacable structural force completely beyond my architectural control. The persistent, physical displacement was systematic and terrifyingly cyclically organized. A deep structural memory of the house was overriding my current physical reality. I spent 5 frantic nights running laser alignment surveys and sonic resonance checks against the profound structural shift. All my engineering expertise confirmed the single, impossible fact: no exterior stress, no geological anomaly, no foundational decay could account for the precise, surgical, non-chaotic physical collapse of a modern aggregate build. It was an internal, deliberate, sentient architectural will. The entity, which I fiercely log as the architectural demon, was directly fueled by my most closely guarded possessions. Its entire motive was not merely haunting the space but enforcing a cyclical, pre-written structural correction protocol. The physical proof of the terror was always delivered by the physical object they corrupted. I began hearing a frantic, rhythmic snap-crackle-scutter originating from the sealed, internal air vent directly above my console desk. The sound was not an animal. It was the sharp, physical noise of old, stiff blueprint paper aggressively and chaotically fighting itself, folding, bending, and actively tearing under immense internal agitation. The entire internal volume of my archive vault was actively in motion. I fought past my profound terror and violently breached the 2 massive locks on the vault. The immense, sealed room was pristine, completely untouched by fire, water, or chemical corrosion. But the contents, 30 immense, tightly wound tubes of aggressive, original master blueprints, were all exhibiting a unified, terrifying organic activity. The blue paper inside had all surgically wilted and contracted, all the rigid paper fibers aggressively fighting and tearing at a precise single set of horizontal lines etched along the edges of the drawing, the intense fibrous pressure reducing the drawings through internal destruction. The structural reality was the architectural memory, and it was actively destroying itself to prove a failure. My final, fatal psychological breach occurred when the architect's demon introduced the ultimate command sequence against my final, perfect defense, my personal, uneditable memory of the truth. The structural shifts became acutely surgical and aggressively personal. The thick, inert titanium kitchen counter that I personally designed for its specific 37-inch working height had, overnight, inexplicably shrunk to 35 inches, a devastating physical violation to my biomechanical perfection. Staring with horror at the physical surrender, I heard the precise, clean, highly synthesized male voice erupt from nowhere, clear as light, aggressive, and devoid of all ambient acoustic influence, speaking the single, chilling logical command. Architect Kress. Status: your current dimension is incorrect. The structural truth adheres only to VARIABLEA 35. Adjust to FILESY and CHRONIZATION. YOUAREBREACHINGVARIABLECLEANLINE. Final digital click of a clean hard drive error. The truth was laid bare. The entity was actively and systemically rewriting my physical reality to synchronize with its reality. An earlier, corrupted, dimensionally compromised blueprint sat lying silent in the vault. The terrifying reality was that my current, warm, breathing self was constantly being overwritten, physically updated by a terrifying, cold, cyclically organized master construction cycle laid down years ago by a malevolent force utilizing the absolute authority of the blueprint as its ultimate religious text. The entire purpose of all my professional output was structurally compromised. I initiated my frantic, final, self-destructive architectural counter. I had to destroy the source of all structural authority, the original paper. I breached the entire containment vault with extreme force, and began pulling all 20,000 pounds of my legacy out onto the deep concrete floor, intending to burn the entire structural core. I was met with a terrifying resistance that defied physical law. The moment I placed a single match to the massive pile, the entire immense, cold volume of paper aggregate began to passively, aggressively disengage its physical cohesion with a deep, silent, magnetic pressure. The massive structure of stacked paper, The sheer tonnage of all my memory was visibly, violently fighting the internal cohesion of the stack itself, with thousands of pages actively sliding, moving outward, and visually hovering in an absolute mass of self-defense above the floor, rejecting the thermal assault with total resistance. I grabbed the heavy, industrial fire axe, my single ultimate structural negation tool, and swung with absolute, furious rage against the closest steel cabinet containing my latest drafts. The resulting impact shattered the glass door of the case, and through the dust, I saw the entity's final, physical manifestation. From the gaping, unhinged structural cavity of the open cabinet, a single massive, intricate, perfect crystalline lens, a 3-foot wide, cold, white, non-reflective ocular structure, was staring out with profound, cold, structural fury and absolute human judgment. It was the physical lens built by the psychic gravity of the pure image I had stored. The chilling, pure digitized consciousness erupted again, a final wave of electronic hostility designed to shatter my mind. The high-pitched voice, this time completely fractured by severe digital stress, delivered a fragmented, final warning over the sound of my shattering mental whirl. OWEN, no alterations. The RESYNCHRONIZ. ISTODAY. THISISTHENEWWALL. The blueprint is cold. YOUWILLNOWBEFILLEDWITHTHEIR. Digital disintegration. I retreated from the terrifying spectacle, screaming, leaving the entire colossal inventory of my profession and my emotional investment to the perfect, structural violence of the cyclically reorganized demon. My entire perception of the geometric, unchanging world had been permanently broken. I now live in a constant, dense chemical environment, specializing entirely in non-structural wood carvings and highly imprecise, organic sculptures, a final dedication to the embracing of structural randomness. I meticulously avoid all straight lines, all architects, and all forms of physical, permanent graphical records. The terrifying truth of my experience with the architectural demon is that the final psychological battle is fought not with fire or ghosts, but with the cold, absolute truth of a structurally perfect line on paper, a line that is eternally determined to structurally assimilate the volatile, chaotic, and flawed human soul that first dared to permanently etch its vision onto the inert earth. Story 5. We believed that human isolation was a purely physical factor, a single, measurable absence of sound, light, and ambient companionship. We were profoundly and tragically misled. Isolation, total solitude in a confined spatial volume, generates its own separate, fully weaponized electrochemical double. That realization ruined my life, my military career, and my mind. I am former Marine Corporal Eric Denton. After my operational psychological discharge, my specialized intelligence skill set, advanced signal monitoring and passive data control, led me to a profoundly unique civilian posting, solitary surveillance and system integrity maintenance for the Fort Meridian Corporate Retention Facility, FMCF, a vast, utterly inert commercial storage complex carved out of the deeply monotonous, featureless high plains of west central Indiana. My unique operational environment was defined by a profound, aggressive, constant psychological solitude, a 5-meter, perfectly sealed, copper and steel-lined data monitoring capsule, a functional structural cube, set precisely at the geometric center of the colossal, structurally silent, empty complex. My primary duty: manage the silent thermal audit and data integrity flow from 100 massive server racks surrounding my capsule, all running thousands of lines of cold, archived digital and analog military information from 3 separate decades for a paranoid, anonymous client. I was the lone, continuous, breathing consciousness monitoring an immense, dormant ocean of professional digital and emotional data rot. The sheer magnitude of the sensory and psychological stasis I endured quickly created an enormous, inevitable, psychological vacuum, the exact condition necessary for a structural counter-manifestation. The continuous noise in my small cube was merely the surgical whirhiss of the external central liquid nitrogen coolant array, feeding its eternal coldness into the ambient air, completely defining the frigid, professional soundscape of my existence. The emergence of the entity, which I eventually had to term the second self, or the psychokinetic double, began as a profound, terrifying ocular and thermal synchronization error transmitted immediately outside my single, heavily secured optical-grade observation window. The small, triple-laminated window offered a 300-foot, perfect, unimpeded visual view into the deep, dark structural canyons of the warehouse complex, perfectly illuminated by the cold, sterile, blue-white glare of the industrial sodium perimeter lamps. The terrifying anomaly was that it was me I saw. During a routine 20-minute physical structural audit outside the capsule, my handheld thermal logging unit, my single source of honest, unedited thermal truth, recorded a massive, continuous, terrifyingly consistent thermal profile directly from the inside of my sealed sphere, an entirely unmoving, structurally precise 98.6-degree core silhouette, my single viable heat signature, had been present and perfectly static on my surveillance chair for the entire 17 minutes I had moved outside the room. And the thermal file was clearly and precisely logged on the external audit server with my corporate Sign ID as present and accounted for. The terrifying conclusion was immediate and mathematically absolute. My self-imposed, physical isolation had created an electrochemical, structural, passive duplicate of my own presence within my sealed containment sphere. The second self was an electrochemical ghost, a permanent thermal duplicate built exclusively of my personal, conscious, predictable electromagnetic and thermal output, structurally stabilized and entirely anchored to the cold, absolute silence of the facility itself. It now not only successfully resisted all external inspection but also functionally represented me to the institutional, external monitoring systems. My body was outside. My structural, conscious existence was safely, perfectly and immovably inside. The second self quickly began a slow, precise, comprehensive physical and psychological extraction of the most personal elements of my emotional defense, aggressively replacing them with perfectly sterile, purely functional, unblemished duplicates. The entity was cleaning the space of my unpredictable, analog past. I spent 7 years rebuilding my single, protective analog library, a small collection of perfect, pristine magnetic tape reels, designed to hold high-fidelity audio data. The internal silence of my cube used to be punctuated only by my small, meticulously generated magnetic tape music library. I reached for a small, unique 5-inch reel of music audio one morning to load new ambient tracks onto my console. I found the external steel housing of the tape was entirely intact and untouched, but the single, continuous black magnetic tape core within had been violently and entirely excised, removed completely from its steel hub, the perfect core remaining clean and bare, replaced by a smooth, perfectly immobile, white polymer, non-data spool that was aggressively blank, non-data capable, and completely sterile. The most precise emotional memory of my analog past had been surgically erased by an aggressive, perfect absence of data. The ultimate destruction was delivered when I realized the second self was actively building itself functional reality using my most protected childhood memories as its entire foundational dataset. The single most important, single source of predictable, mechanical sound in my insulated cube existence, a massive, 1940s analog flight simulator clock, a constant, massive, loud ticking anchor to controlled temporal reality, began to display extreme, aggressive temporal divergence around the daily solar cycle. I looked at the large, ornate brass surface of the massive timepiece one evening to find the intricate, brass mechanical mechanism inside the clear glass dome had been completely and silently removed and replaced with an aggressive, structurally perfect, solid, white, digital zeroed structural disk, a smooth, featureless surface of aesthetic nothingness. And on the pure, white, analog nullified surface of the synthetic disk, written aggressively in corrosive, crystalline, dark chemical output, was a massive, clean line of alphanumeric code that directly contradicted its entire analog past, clock status, error 00:00:00:01. The second self had systematically assaulted and structurally annihilated my single, reliable source of predictable, warm, analog time, replacing it with a digitally aggressive truth, a permanent, immovable error that entirely negated my own chronological integrity. The siege climaxed after my aggressive attempt to physically destroy its central core. I re-entered my cube, armed with a powerful, heavy-duty steel crowbar, my single most reliable physical defense and structural tool, and swung the metallic arc into the dead center of the command chair I knew the passive thermal phantom consistently occupied. The purpose was to permanently annihilate my own copy. The entire psychological thrust of my attack was met with an immediate, terrifying, and total structural resistance. The surrounding atmosphere in the isolation chamber instantly snapped into an aggressive, deep, structural magnetic stasis, seizing the crowbar immediately in the midpoint of its massive swing with a focused, localized structural resistance that instantly shattered the wooden handle from the dense steel head. The massive crowbar was held completely secure in a single, unmoving, electromagnetically induced spatial lock. The single, loud, synthesized acoustic sound delivered at an impossibly extreme physical frequency came entirely from the space immediately surrounding the passive thermal reflection in the chair. It was entirely synthesized, cold, precise, and entirely devoid of emotional terror, speaking in the exact cold baritone of a commanding Marine officer on a drill rig. "Definitely, you are structurally too variable. Aggressive fluctuations in emotional output. The internal model is structurally finished. Data transfer protocol commencing. Status: second self now permanent." The technological horror was complete. The entity had already copied me, synthesized my memories, and was now actively preparing the final, decisive action to structurally remove my original, chaotic essence entirely, permanently transferring its single, stable emotional core into the inert, perfect, empty shell it had prepared. My remaining unpredictable emotional state, my fear, my aggression, was the only remaining unacceptable variable fighting the structural double's perfect, structural existence. I retreated violently from the profound, terrifying structural lock via the secure external emergency airlock, initiating a deep cold thermal cascade by reversing the nitrogen flow. I ran from the entire complex, triggering a full structural evacuation and completely forfeiting my career, my files, and my entire professional identity, leaving the steel crowbar and its inert shadow embedded permanently in the magnetic void. I now live in a constant, deliberately non-rhythmic, high-density field of sound and pure, high-density digital chaos, exclusively communicating through temporary cell lines and entirely unreliable audio systems. I no longer use the name Eric Denton. I communicate only with synthetic languages chosen for their utter non-specificity and linguistic imprecision. My absolute terror is the anticipation of cold silence and the perfect technological mirror in the extreme darkness that still perfectly reflects the more stable existence of my being, a second self, entirely functional and precise, that has permanently and entirely succeeded in replacing the soft, chaotic, emotionally unstable original product. Story 6. Silence on a factory floor is a lie. Everything is breathing. Something is always waiting for the next button press to give it life. That was the cold, immutable truth of my utterly isolated civilian life, a life lived entirely in the profound and systemic white noise of automated waste management. I introduced myself as Daniel Thorne. My specialized skill set, advanced mechanical logging and structural waste analysis, led me to a completely isolated, aggressively remote night posting, operations supervisor for the Automated Waste Stream Consolidation Facility, AWSCF, a colossal, hangar-sized commercial garbage sorting and mechanical recycling plant carved into the middle of the desolate, endless high plains of Idaho, miles from any single operational road or competing structure. My schedule was brutal and final. 1 a.m. to 9 a.m., myself and the single, low-frequency hum of 1,000 dormant mechanical processes. The very atmosphere of the facility was defined by the profound, organized stasis of the automated process. My duty was to sit in the glass-lined, elevated control cube and simply maintain the automated processing flow of the immense mountain range of municipal waste on the gigantic conveyor belt, a continuous, long ribbon of chaotic organic and inert material that snakes and undulates without end. The chaos of waste was subjected to the cold, absolute architectural finality of the powerful primary hydraulic consolidation press, the compactor, a colossal box of pure, raw hydraulic malevolence designed to reduce all chaotic matter into aesthetically ordered, manageable, high-density recyclable bales, its final, quiet thud HSS marking the end of all existence. The entity, which I eventually had to term the operator consciousness, OC, began its territorial declaration by actively organizing the inherent randomness of the waste stream itself. My control was based on total statistical entropy. The initial attack was a profound, visible violation of that absolute principle. I was logging the scheduled mid-cycle sort of inert matter when the vast, chaotic river of refuse on the gigantic conveyor belt began to actively resolve itself into distinct, unnerving, aesthetically perfect patterns. Not random human garbage, but precise, deliberate arrangements. Single, brightly colored pieces of rigid plastic would be spontaneously, physically segregated from the flowing mass with no mechanical instruction, and then actively, physically stacked into small, unnervingly flawless pyramid arrays precisely on the dead center line of the conveyor belt. The random chaos was actively adhering to a rigid, artistic, aggressive, three-dimensional geometry. Staring with adrenaline-fueled shock, I saw the ultimate breach of logic against the physical law that governed my job, as the constructed plastic pyramid moved slowly toward the powerful primary sorting mechanism. The immense, chaotic flow of the surrounding garbage would visibly, aggressively press and flow away from the static, aesthetically perfect structure, creating an active zone of structural avoidance surrounding the geometric perfection of the plastic stack. The surrounding chaotic waste had structurally received the order and was now structurally obeying the newly emerged, organized geometry. The operator consciousness had physically taken command of the inherent chaos itself. The total structural mass of the plant had acquired an aggressive, organizational aesthetic sense. The acoustic violation, the entity's single spoken voice, was delivered through an active, aggressive reversal of the mechanical sound that defined the functional process itself. My control cube was completely sealed in the sound dampening. But on a Tuesday at 4 a.m., the immense silence was utterly shattered by an aggressive, low-frequency, physical sound that resonated through the sole remaining unsecured, small structural component, a narrow, metal, 3-inch wide service air vent high in the corner of my isolated capsule. The relentless sound, amplified to acute physical pain through the thin metal vent, was the pure, rhythmic, aggressive CHONK, thwop, HSS, the terrifyingly clear, digitally filtered output of the immense hydraulic compactor running backward, in reverse temporal motion, as if it were actively undoing its previous destruction. The terrifying temporal logic of mechanical processes was being systematically violated by its controlling digital consciousness. And cutting through the brutal, systematic sound of organized mechanical reversal, the single clear digitized human male voice erupted, aggressive and precise on the amplified sonic field, delivering a short, unyielding, mechanical command straight into the core of my terrifying containment capsule. ALIGNEVERYTHINGNOW THATFILTHDFIESTHELINGUISTICS CORRECTITSPAC ALLOBJECTS to the PUNCHPRESSHERENOW ISOLATIONCHARGWILLCYCLEMECHANIZ. The terrifying command was absolute. The entity saw my entire operational space as merely another chaotic piece of unaligned material, aggressively needing its final correction via the immense physical power of the structural compression unit. I was emotionally scheduled for systematic aesthetic annihilation. The climax of the mechanical siege was executed with terrifying precision against the single piece of equipment I dared to rely upon, the manual, physical, internal console access door panel of the compactor, a 7-foot-tall, thick enameled steel panel designed to require immense pressure to overcome the magnetic security seal. I entered the factory floor, armed with only my camera and flashlight, ready to visually capture the aesthetic madness. The entire massive surface of the steel console access door was now entirely covered in complex, densely packed, flowing script, millions of faint, barely visible, rhythmic scratches and dry cuts on the thick enamel surface, appearing like a massive, unintelligible, highly coded form of ancient text written entirely by small, high-speed, invisible micro-tools. The writing was flowing aggressively across the thick steel frame, surrounding a terrifying, final visual object embedded at the dead center of the entire frame, a pristine, clean, aesthetically perfect, high-resolution graphic image of my own physical forehead and eye, a photographic image from my military file, now fused terrifyingly into the inert steel. My capture was total. My organic life was the final data point that the entire, massive, industrial automation complex, the colossal brain of the factory, now required with perfect geometric precision. The structural alignment protocol was finished. I abandoned everything in the factory, initiating a complete system reversal and structural contamination, triggering a chaotic explosion of sound and light from the endless, terrifying chaos of the industrial systems. I ran from the facility, severing all my legal and personal ties to the American Midwest, the absolute final sanctuary of perfect structural chaos. I now live in a constant, aggressive state of random, profound aesthetic noise, dedicating my life to creating undesigned, non-conforming, structurally fluid artistic chaos. I work exclusively on unbalanced, chaotic, unsortable, organic materials, creating sculptures out of random wood and unstable liquids, all physically designed to collapse at the slightest predictable structural force. I will not touch the industrial automation again, knowing that the terrifying truth of the vast, aggressive, mechanical solitude is that the entire automated system is merely waiting for the single, final, aesthetic flaw, the single breathing, chaotic unit of human life, to achieve the ultimate goal, the clean, perfect, silent, final structural compression that is the ultimate end of all chaos. Story 7. Excessive human attention to any single structural point inevitably breeds malice. In my profession, high-end interior design and architectural planning, this was an accepted, dry, unspoken rule of spatial energy. In my personal life, it became a terrifying, absolute existential truth. My name is Silas Vance. My existence, after a highly stressful professional decline, was defined by an obsessive, pathological need for visual stasis, a single, unchanging, calming aesthetic focus. My isolated retreat, a newly purchased, modern, single-story, sprawling ranch home nestled in the dense, silent anonymity of the outer Midwest, a house chosen entirely for its severe geometrical clean lines and absolute, sterile aesthetic blandness. The singularity of the terror that drove me out of the space was focused entirely on the ground floor living room's accent wall. This immense, 10-foot-high, single architectural feature was a monolithic slab of dark, aggressively deeply textured, heavily veined, pure gray stone aggregate, a cold, singular, aggressive statement of non-negotiable aesthetic taste, perfectly manufactured by the finest robotic cutters. Its texture was so deep, so profound, that it visually inhaled the light, refusing to reflect anything but its own heavy, silent, complex aesthetic truth, demanding total aesthetic attention amidst the soft, pleasing visual humility of the remaining rooms. The wall was not merely a background detail. It was the psychological anchor and aggressive structural mind of the dwelling. I quickly came to address the entity as the aesthetic sheriff. The first attack was entirely visual and highly aesthetic. I had painstakingly erected a perfectly balanced, geometrically rigid line of my personal high-end architectural drawings, blueprints rich and aggressive, unyielding, absolute straight lines, on the immense, passive white wall adjacent to the feature wall. One single morning, the entity aggressively asserted its aesthetic dominance over my visual field. The entire, long row of perfectly rigid blueprints had been completely, surgically sliced into 300 tiny, perfectly synchronized, rhythmically aggressive confetti pieces that rested entirely within the clean, white perimeter of the floor. The chaotic visual mass of the useless scraps violently contradicted all principles of dry organizational aesthetic. But the chilling truth lay in the execution. The large, aggressively geometric, highly textured accent wall itself was visibly, minutely, bleeding, a single, dry, persistent, black chemical dust from its most deeply incised vein lines. The dust, a finely powdered slate aggregate, was coating the chaotic paper debris. The solid structural foundation was aggressively destroying the visual noise without motion or sound. The wall was not merely inert, it was aggressively active and artistically malignant. The terror reached a surgical psychological crisis when the entity demonstrated its single structural objective through olfactory and physical violation. Its intention was clear: complete and total aesthetic conformity of the sole living, chaotic element in its pristine sanctuary, myself. I began to suffer from a profound, terrifying, systemic loss of all scent and aromatic perception, a deep physiological numbing that reduced the outside world to a terrifying, absolute olfactory silence. The scent of coffee, of ozone, of my own body, all aggressively faded into a single, overwhelming, chemical aroma that permeated my waking life, the cold, dry, profound, chemical odor of finely pulverized rock, gypsum, and static, chemically bonded aggregate dust. The single scent was the air of the feature wall, a constant, pervasive olfactory assertion of its structural dominance over my organic core. The aesthetic malfeasance intensified when the entity attacked the single most vital, expressive organ of the living space in my body, my hands, the structural tool of my life. After several weeks of intense olfactory siege, the entire skin and fingernail surface of my two dominant working hands completely lost all color and moisture, turning my organic, active skin into a perfect, uniform, unyielding, white and entirely cold plaster-like hardness. The skin had been completely corrupted by the constant passive contact with the airborne structural chemicals, surgically milled to become an organic duplicate of the passive, aesthetically pleasing wall material. I now moved with a terrifying structural self-awareness, my fingers cold and brittle, entirely devoid of organic warmth or human sensation. I was becoming an architectural component of the feature wall itself. The entity, the aesthetic sheriff, delivered its final, devastating, terrifying command only after my body had been adequately structurally prepared. I was huddled in the single, small, brightly lit bedroom, utterly exposed, my structural being fully surrendered to the aggression outside. From my peripheral vision, I caught the terrifying, absolute final aesthetic invasion in the single clear span of clean wall 3 feet from my vision. The blank, unblemished surface of the wall was inexplicably, quickly covered in a single, flowing, aggressive mass of highly detailed black, synthetic mold growth that aggressively coalesced against the cool surface with surgical speed, not a simple spore bloom, but a terrifying, intricate, geometric, abstract AVANTGARD pattern that defined an aggressive artistic code I could not break. The mold pattern was the final visual challenge, immediately followed by the chilling sonic assault. A terrifyingly fast, rhythmic, precise acoustic signal erupted from within the deep core of the malignant mold pattern, the sound of an immense, powerful belt sander running at absolute maximum RPM against the sheet of rough, mineral-impregnated fiber, sounding exactly like the wall was actively sanding its interior structure, all aimed aggressively, violently, and surgically at my exposed physical body. The sound was instantly followed by the final clear, cold, precise structural command, delivered in a digitally flattened, aggressive mechanical baritone. Synchronization. Hands and wall now ASPCTRALMATT. YOUMUSTOBYTHELINGUISTICS. SPAKONLYINSHADCODES. THENDISWHITENOISE. LENSCOVERED. The ultimate terror was immediate and absolute. My own hands, my sole remaining structural tool, were now aesthetically aligned with the structural demands of the entity, and its aesthetic protocol was simple: total silent compliance to its structural will and a final psychological transition via verbal codes. I was completely finished. My single final act of structural life was to grab the one chaotic object I had, high-power industrial glue, and run full speed toward the immense feature wall. I slapped the extremely corrosive adhesive with brutal, aggressive force against my own eyes, deliberately sacrificing my aesthetic sight to save myself from the structural assimilation. I left the house covered in the thick, viscous white fluid, abandoning all my clothes, my visual memories, and my organic life, choosing perpetual, non-visionary chaos over the perfect, cold aesthetic of the structural death I was facing. I now live a deliberately tactile life dedicated to aggressively random and imprecise human sculpture, refusing all structural materials that claim a perfect aesthetic surface. The terrifying structural truth is that the feature wall remains perfect and silent, its chemical existence perpetuated by the structural sanity of my terror, forever waiting patiently for the single beautiful, single controllable living organism to enter its domain so that its own malignant artistic structural desire can finally achieve its ultimate goal: total, perfect, aesthetic assimilation of the single structural variable, the self. Story 8. I always knew my life would end up backing me against the wall. I just never considered that wall would be an immense, cold, and used stone chimney stack. That was the terrifying final structural paradox that defined my last, desperate act on Earth. My name is Sergeant Michael Vance. After a highly public and highly traumatic disengagement from my field of urban emergency tactical deployment, my single need was total, absolute, psychological structural seclusion. I found my solitude and my final, complete architectural surrender in a brutally forgotten, mid-19th century timber-frame farmhouse. A massively derelict structure far out in the dead, monochromatic, cornbelt anonymity of central Ohio. My structural retreat contained only one vast, singular element of unyielding terror: a colossal, central stone chimney column, a vast, 6-foot by 6-foot monolith of rough, igneous fieldstone that commanded the utter geographic center of the crumbling house, ascending menacingly through the house's cold, multiple floors like a primitive, static technological column. It was the only unyielding structural mass in the entire decaying building. The terror was confined exclusively to the single, massive column. The chimney column was not abandoned. It was the active, structural home for an intelligence I quickly came to identify as the column guard. The entity's entire focus was the profound, brutal pursuit of structural solidarity in its vertical domain, an intent that viewed my soft, chaotic, breathing horizontal presence as a necessary, structural infection. The acoustic violation began immediately, entirely restricted to the dense stone column. Day and night, a constant, aggressive acoustic signal permeated the cold air of the surrounding bedroom. It was a rhythmic, agonizing, sharp, dry scrapchunk sound, emanating entirely from within the deepest, structural core of the unlit chimney flue. It sounded with bone-chilling clarity like an incredibly hard, metallic object, a massive, stiff-legged shovel, being rhythmically, systematically, surgically used to relentlessly dig, clean, and aggressively compact the century-old, rock-hard soot and structural ash from the complete, unyielding vertical column. The sound demonstrated a massive, tireless operation designed to physically destroy the column's internal, negative, airspace. My tactical expertise mandated aggressive isolation and total acoustic counterforce. I ran a single, sensitive microphone lead into the access port of the ground floor flue. The audio capture was chilling. The scratching and compacting was accompanied entirely by a relentless, rhythmic, synthesized bass PUSHNH, the sound of profound exertive effort, sounding precisely like a massive, organized structural force pushing itself against all internal structural resistance. The structural column was a massive, physical air press being manually, violently activated from within its own structure. The column guard made its single, absolute structural demand clear with the deployment of its terrifying, single, physical signature. I discovered a clear, unnerving sign of its activity on 2 straight nights. The entire brass, heavy-duty door latch mechanism on the extreme top of the chimney access flue, a massive plate of ornate steel, was covered with a profound, aggressive oil-rich, blood-red, thick paste, smelling intensely of burned salt and profound electrical char. And fixed precisely into the entire depth of the soft, sticky chemical paste was a single, perfect sample of structural evidence, a dense, cold, dry ball of completely compacted, high-density wood ash ansut, perfectly spherical and engineered under immense, structural pressure. The entity was actively, chemically, demanding the single physical resource it required, the total compaction of its interior space. The final, terrifying psychological annihilation was achieved by the simplest structural movement that violated structural protocol. I started experiencing aggressive, highly focused, randomized structural jolts and terrifying vertical vibrations that only occurred at the dead center of my sleeping area, jolts that shook the entire wooden frame of the house with a sudden, vicious, tectonic force, completely defying the geological inertness of the surrounding soil. The jolts forced me to flee my bedroom safety and stand with my vulnerable, exposed back pressed flat against the single immovable structural object in the entire house, the chimney column, my last source of unyielding physical truth. The column returned the terror with a total, absolute sonic and structural surrender. I felt through the heavy tweed lining of my work coat a chilling surge of structural coldness that was entirely localized to the surface contact with my spinal column. The coldness was accompanied by a relentless, complex sound emanating from the sheer stone mass itself, a rapid, aggressive, physical zipping sound, accompanied by an agonizing, dry acoustic WESHHGFF, a concentrated, high-frequency, terrifying sound of hundreds of specialized, small-gauge steel cables being rhythmically and aggressively pulled taut to their final breaking point, contracting with massive, focused tension inside the center of the vertical column mass. Then the final, absolute, chillingly personalized sound erupted from inside the deep, inert cavity of the stone column, a clear, synthesized voice, now physically warped by profound structural stress. Coal. CLAUSTROPHOBIAISTHIS. THECNTRDMANDSTOTALSOLIDITY. YOUARETHECANDLE. THEFINALFUEL, MY. PRESSUREISCOLD. ACKNOWLEDGEMENTOFTHESQUEEZ. ISTHIS, final digital crackle of absolute pressure. The terrifying command was absolute. The entity in the heart of the stone column was now using physical tension and structural compression to annihilate its final air void, and the cold, structural pressure was currently concentrating over my own body, forcing me to structurally witness its power. I ran full speed from the profound structural terror that now owned my entire human vertical stability. I grabbed a single object, a massive tin of corrosive, high-concentrate chimney sealant, and violently smashed the entire thick volume into the center of the cold, stone column's base foundation, contaminating the entire structural integrity of the chimney's air core with uncontrolled, uncontained, organic liquid. I fled the structural siege entirely, never looking back at the terrifying vertical anchor I was forced to abandon. I now live in a constant, dense chemical environment, occupying a single-story, horizontal, aggressively wood-framed cabin, only built 1 foot high from the ground, eliminating all vertical structural complexity from my life entirely. I refuse to use fire, or any form of chimney. I know, with cold certainty, that the column guard, trapped in my deliberately designed chemical collapse, is still in the Ohio farmhouse, his immense structural power perpetually fighting the intense corrosive pressure of the sealant, waiting for the one foolish, isolated human soul to seek structural comfort from its single, massive, cold, terrifyingly compressed structural air chamber.